Number 1.
Reed Taylor Jeppson, age 15, went missing from Salt Lake City, Utah, on October 11, 1964. It was a Sunday, and the Jeppson family had just returned home to 1951 Browning Avenue after attending church. Reed's sister was starting dinner when Reed came into the kitchen and opened cans of dog food. He then left the house to feed and walk his 2 German short-haired pointer dogs, one of which was a puppy. A friend reported seeing Reed with his dogs near the now-defunct St. Mary of the Wasatch School, not far from the Jeppson home. This is the last reported sighting of Reed and his dogs. By all accounts, Reed was not a troubled child, and he had no reason to run away. He was the son of a doctor, and he had 11 siblings. He was on East High School's football team and had just scored his first touchdown. He also had a paper route, and the money he had saved was left at home, along with all his other belongings. It's possible he had $40 in cash on him when he vanished. Although there was an intensive search for Reed at the time of his disappearance, his case quickly went cold, and for decades, it was not investigated. Recently, at the urging of Reed's family, it has been looked at again. A tip was received which led police to search a gully near Clayton Middle School, about half a block from the Jeppson home. Cadaver dogs initially showed interest in a specific spot, and it was excavated, but the dogs eventually stopped indicating anything was there. The search was halted at that time. It is not believed that Reed left of his own accord, and his brothers and sisters continue to search for him. His parents have since died. His father passed just over a year after his disappearance. Although I do tend to agree with Reed's family, who insists he would not have run away, I find a stranger abduction unlikely also. Reed was an athletic, muscular teen, and he had 2 dogs with him. It was the middle of the day, and the area was not secluded. He would not have been an easy target. There is the possibility that Reed could have been offered a ride home from a stranger that he might ordinarily have accepted. It was much more common back then, and I've never seen any indication from his family one way or the other as to whether he would have accepted a ride from a stranger. I feel that it's a mostly moot point anyway. Because he was walking his dogs and was very close to home, it doesn't make sense to me that he would have accepted a ride, even from someone he knew well. That would defeat the whole purpose of walking the dogs. I've wondered if perhaps Reed encountered someone who asked him for help, and he went with them. Or less likely, that one of his dogs got away from him, and he'd gone into a secluded area to retrieve the dog, and something happened there. I had also considered the idea that he'd been hit by a car and the driver panicked, but I find it unlikely that this could have occurred without anyone seeing anything, and I think the dogs would have been found if this were the case. Since the school where Reed was last seen closed down in 1969, I've been unable to map the route he would have taken home to see if there were any wooded areas or rivers near where he was walking. I am wondering what type of tip was received that led police to search the gully. Did the tipster have an idea of who might have been involved or what the motive might have been? The fact that the dogs hid initially kind of makes me think there was something to it. I am hopeful that someone out there has the missing piece of the puzzle that can bring Reed home to his family.
Number 2.
A macabre, decades-old secret hangs over this New England farm town hugging the Connecticut River. A retired judge thinks he has unlocked it. Prosperous but unpopular dairy farmer Orville Gibson disappeared in the wee hours of New Year's Eve 1957. Searchers pulled his bound body from the river nearly 3 months later. The case remains officially unsolved, but it's been widely accepted for decades that a small mob of drunken townspeople, incensed by rumors that Gibson had beaten his elderly hired man, kidnapped him, tied him up, and threw him in a car trunk, where he suffocated. They threw his body into the river. The crime was deemed a lynching by editorial writers from Boston to Washington to the Civil Rights era South. All the players in Vermont were white, but white supremacists in the South used the story to cry they were being unfairly singled out for the mob killings of black men. The story spread across the globe, even earning a feature in Life magazine. You can go anywhere, quite a ways off, and if you say you're from Newbury, they'll bring it up, said Eleanor Placey, 72, who was related to Gibson by marriage. 2 men later went on trial, but were both acquitted. So what really happened? Judge Stephen Martin, who as a new lawyer in 1960 helped represent one of the accused, recently published a book in which he argues Orville Gibson killed himself, with some ingenuity and difficulty, in a largely successful attempt to get revenge on his neighbors, by pinning the blame on them. In Orville's Revenge, The Anatomy of a Suicide, Martin argues that Gibson, broken by the criminal charge he was facing in the hired man's beating, and by the enmity he had created among his neighbors, staged evidence at his farm, walked over a bridge to New Hampshire, climbed out on a pier, tied himself up and rolled himself into the water. He was very proud, quick to hold a grudge, and his whole life was crashing down upon him, Martin said in an interview. Martin has taken his conclusions to the Vermont Attorney General's office, whose investigators plan to take another look. They could reclassify the case and remove it from the list of Vermont's unsolved homicides. Not everybody buys Martin's theory. I don't know why a supposedly intelligent man like Judge Martin would say that, said Doris McClintock, 75, Gibson's niece, who still believes some of her neighbors know what happened to her uncle. McClintock and the Placeys offer point-by-point rebuttals of why they believe Martin's book is inaccurate, getting basic facts wrong, and ignoring others that don't fit his thesis. They speak of threats they believe were intended to keep people quiet, including one in which a note was stuck with a knife to a tree outside the home of a potential witness. WCAX.com Local Vermont News, Weather and Sports CBS affiliate WCAX, reported that Larry Washburn and Bill Graham, both state troopers in 1957, questioned dozens of Newberry residents, but everyone claimed they knew nothing. A lot of secrecy. No one was talking, said Washburn. Martin's theory isn't entirely new, but the book lays it out in detail. The idea that Gibson could have tied himself up was brought up during the second trial, but investigators didn't accept it. Gibson, 47 when he died, came to Newberry with his family as a child. He purchased the farm out of foreclosure several years before his death. Over the years, he built it up to be one of the richest properties in the fertile land along the river. But he never fit in. He and his wife weren't part of the partying crowd. He drew resentment for being the early bird at the courthouse to purchase his property, beating more established townspeople who wanted it. And then came the last straw, the story about the beating of his hired man. Gibson was charged with a crime, though some argue the man's injuries were exaggerated by the town rumor mill. The day Gibson disappeared, he had planned to visit a lawyer. Eleanor Placey's husband, David, now 71, responded the day of the disappearance to a call from Gibson's wife, when her husband didn't return from the morning milking. In the barn, he saw evidence of a crime, including depressions in a grain bag where he believed two men had sat, drag marks on the floor and a crushed milk pail. It was pretty plain that something happened there. There was not a question in your mind, Placey said recently. Police dragged the river but found nothing until the end of March, when troopers discovered Gibson's body miles downstream. He was wearing his farm clothes, his ankles were bound, and his hands were tied behind his knees. His body was in remarkable condition. The death certificate cites suffocation, means unknown. It wasn't until fall 1958 that a doctor told investigators he had driven by Gibson's barn the morning the farmer disappeared, and saw a car he recognized and two men he knew. Those two men, Robert Ozzie Welch and Frank Carpenter, went on trial separately. Welch was acquitted after the judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. A jury cleared Carpenter, represented with help from Martin. Martin, who became a judge in 1970 and retired in 1998, argues investigators never allowed themselves to consider possibilities other than a vigilante killing. He is seeking the support of the Vidic Society, a private organization of sleuths that specializes in solving old crimes. Society member Peter Stevenson said he believes Martin's explanation. If vigilantes had killed Gibson, his body would have been beaten to a pulp. And by killing himself, Gibson was able to take control of a life that was spiraling down, he said. If you look at Orville's behavior pre-crime, you'll find that a lot of people had tried to take control of his life, Stevenson said. By now, most of the original players are dead. Gibson's wife died in 1973. Welch died 2 months after the trial. Carpenter died in 1972. Despite the ugly memories it dredges up, Gibson's niece said she thinks it's good people are talking about our uncle again. We would just like to know the answers, McClintock said. I don't think there's any purpose of trying to arrest anyone. It's way past time for that.
Number 3.
West Point police have a suspect in the cold case of Elisie Mae Roane. Roane was just 16 years old when she disappeared from the small town on May 20, 1957. West Point Police Chief Bobby Mauger says they have recently interviewed a suspect multiple times. Mauger wasn't able to release the name of the suspect because of the ongoing investigation, but says the suspect is a male and around the same age as Roane. Roane was last seen walking with 2 suitcases late at night in downtown West Point. After that, she was never seen or heard from again. Originally, many people believed she had left on her own and would come back. The case went cold, and her whereabouts have been a mystery for 58 years. Roane was an only child and lived with her adoptive father. Her adoptive mother had died 2 years prior to her disappearance. To date, this is the only missing persons cold case in West Point. In 2012, Mauger and his investigators took another look at the case. After a number of interviews during their investigation, they were able to name a suspect. All of the things that we checked, all of the angles we searched, and the research we did in the investigation, we were unable to prove that she did not leave on her own free will, said Mauger. Mauger says he hopes to close this case and bring closure to the entire community. We may never have the right evidence to prosecute, and at this point I'm not concerned with that. My focus right now is to find Elisie Mae and her child, and give them a proper burial, Mauger told 13 News Now. Mauger says even with a suspect named, police are still looking for help from the community. If you know anything about the disappearance or whereabouts of Elisie Mae Roane, call West Point Police at 804-843-2800.
Number 4.
When Spokane police solved the 62-year-old cold case murder of 9-year-old Candace Candy Elaine Rogers, it sent a wave of emotions and memories through multiple generations of her family. One family member recalled her parents and siblings unknowingly living next to Rogers' murderer before he killed himself at his home. One of Rogers' cousins remembered searching for hours for her the night she went missing. Yet another relative, a 19-year-old Gonzaga University student, said the fact the case was solved largely through DNA analysis nudged her further toward a career in forensic science. The Spokane Police Department announced in November that DNA confirmed John Rei Hoff, who wasn't a suspect in the killing until that year, had abducted, raped and strangled Rogers. Rogers was selling Campfire Girls mints when she went missing during the evening of March 6, 1959, in west central Spokane, about 3½ miles northwest of Spokane Falls Community College, under a pile of pine needles and brush some 130 feet off Old Trails Road. Police found Rogers' body 16 days later. We have a kidnapping of an innocent 9-year-old who was brutally and violently assaulted and murdered, Spokane Police Chief Craig Meidel said when Hoff's identity was announced. A 9-year-old who had absolutely no concept of evil that exists. There are few crimes that are more impactful to a family member than the murder of a loved one. The killer next door, Karen Jo Tierney's parents and 2 older siblings, lived next door to Hoff and his family on West Rosewood Avenue in northwest Spokane for about 1½ years, until the 31-year-old man killed himself in 1970, before Tierney was born. Tierney's mother, Judy Geisbush Tierney, was Rogers' cousin. Tierney said they did not know Hoff was the killer until police made the cold case breakthrough in November. Her mother lived in that same Rosewood house until her death in 2015. Now, Tierney lives there with her father. She said her parents didn't know Hoff well. Tierney said her brother remembers Hoff's chemical burn on his face that he sustained working at a Spokane meatpacking plant, and that Hoff's wife wore a lot of makeup. Tierney said she was told that Hoff's wife one day in 1970 ran out of the Hoff couple's house, screaming that Hoff had a gun. Tierney said her siblings were outside playing, so her mother called them into the house. Hoff then reportedly shot himself in the doorway of his house, Tierney said. She said she was told her mother helped clean up the mess from Hoff's suicide. Tierney said her mother kept a large scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings of Rogers' case. John Geisbush, Rogers' oldest cousin and Judy Tierney's brother, said his sister would often show visitors to her Rosewood Avenue home, her scrapbook of Rogers. He said he believed Hoff and his wife were shown the scrapbook. The guy really probably got his nose rubbed in it without the person who was rubbing his nose in it knowing about it, Geisbusch said. And maybe that did increase the stresses the guy was having. Geisbusch, now 78 years old living near Kingston, Washington, said his sister was adamant police would find Rogers' killer. I just thought it was sort of ironic that John Hoff lived right next door to her, he said. Tierney said our mom would be mortified if she knew Hoff was the killer. I guess I thought more of my mom and how close she was to this, and how she would feel about it, Tierney said through tears. An emotional trip. Geisbusch and Judy Tierney's twin sister, Joanne Poss, recall receiving the news their cousin was missing. Geisbusch, a 15-year-old Gonzaga prep student at the time, said his friend and his friend's father picked him up from his house on East Carlisle Avenue and went looking for Rogers, as dozens of others did the night she went missing. Rogers' mother notified his mother the evening Rogers disappeared. It kind of rattled us a little bit, Geisbusch said. Geisbusch said they searched the Fort George Wright area for 4 or 5 hours deep into the night. There was a light dusting of snow, so he looked for footprints. He described the volunteers' search that night as unguided and a free-for-all. Geisbusch said he thought Rogers got lost or something, and did not believe she was dead. I was extremely hopeful, he said. I really was. Poss, now 76 and living in 9 Mile Falls, said she was attending a campfire girls' sleepover in Spokane the night Rogers went missing. Poss, who was 13 at the time, said she remembered not being able to sleep that night because she was worried about her cousin. People continued looking for Rogers in the days that followed. The next 2 weeks was just constant candy talk, Poss said. Poss said she was naive and did not think anything terrible happened to Rogers during the more than 2 weeks she was missing. Similar to Geisbusch, she figured she got lost or fell and hurt herself. Poss said she was walking out the door to church when her mother told Poss that Rogers had been found. Poss assumed she was alive. It wasn't until she returned to church that her mother told her Rogers was dead. Things like that just never happened, and if they did happen, they happened in other cities with other people, not to you, Poss said. Geisbusch said he didn't remember if he was immediately told the circumstances of her death. It's hard to fathom what Candy went through, Geisbusch said. She was like most pleasant, laughing, 9-10-year-old kids. Geisbusch said he had never heard of Hoff. It was really uplifting, he said, of the case being solved. Can you imagine? 62 years later, Spokane police were still spending that much effort to find somebody who had done a terrible thing. That was kind of an uplifting thing, that we're not letting go of it until it's found. Poss said she was shocked when she learned on the news in November that police identified Hoff as Rogers' killer. It brought back terrible emotions, Poss said. She said she figured the cold case would never be solved, despite their prayers. Poss said she was active in Campfire Girls for years, and Rogers was often a topic of conversation. I lived at every candy sale and thought of what had happened, she said. Poss said her daughter made phone calls after hearing the newscast, and within 15 minutes, Sergeant Zach Stormont, a detective with Spokane Police's Major Crimes Unit, called and profusely apologized to her and her immediate family for them finding out about Rogers' killer from a news station. She said Stormont told her he did not know she existed, and he visited her house that day for over 2 hours, walking her and other family members through the case. It's been an emotional trip, she said. A new chapter in a family tragedy. Emily Evers, Rogers' third cousin, was born 43 years after Rogers' death. But the Gonzaga biology student said Poss, Evers' grandmother, told her Rogers' story multiple times, partially as a warning to her and her siblings to be careful. She said it was a relief to hear the news that Rogers' killer had been identified. It was also inspiring. I think when I heard about Candy's case, and how it was solved completely with just DNA sequencing, that really inspired me a lot to look into it. More, Evers said of forensic science. Evers toured the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in Cheney December 17, and met Brittany Wright, a forensic scientist at the lab, who concluded 3 months ago that Hoff's DNA matched the DNA pulled from Rogers' clothing. I can't imagine how much hard work and dedication she put into solving this to help not just my family, but everyone else, because it's such an important case in the Spokane community, Evers said. It's very inspiring. Evers said she wants to apply for an internship at the Cheney lab, and while she is strongly considering working as a forensic scientist, she is still undecided on her career. She graduated high school at 16 years old, is in her junior year at Gonzaga, and in her first semester in the school's Army ROTC program. Her father served as a U.S. Army colonel before retiring after 26 years of service. She said she always enjoyed learning about science throughout her schooling. Going into college, working in labs, I would put in my earbuds, listen to music, and just have the time of my life in the lab, she said. I know I want to use my skills and abilities in science to help other people, and that's why I know I want to pursue something in biology, because it's something I'm so passionate about, and I've just always enjoyed. Evers said caring for others is an important value in her family, and something she plans to integrate into whatever her career turns out to be. We all just really care about the community and are very protective over our loved ones, and just have a really strong sense of loyalty and service, Evers said. And I think that's what kind of draws me to biological forensics and DNA analysis, because Spokane is just something that I've grown up really caring for, and everyone in my family has grown up really caring for, and I don't want to see anybody else hurt. That's one of the most painful things about Candy's case, is that the man who hurt her could have hurt other people too. Poss said her hope is to create a scholarship at Gonzaga in Roger's name. It would ideally be presented to a science student, hopefully to an individual pursuing a career in forensic science, she said. In the meantime, Poss said her daughter is working with the Spokane Parks Department about putting something at the West Central Community Center in Roger's name. Now that it's over, Poss said, I don't want her forgotten.
Number 5.
It's a cold case nearly 46 years old of a missing mother. Now her adult children are tackling the investigation with their own resources, determined to solve her disappearance. The main suspect may have taken the secret of her death to his own grave. This story started in Moundsville, West Virginia. A young mother of two, Annita Price, was going through a divorce and custody battle. She was on her way to work in May of '74, but never made it there. Her case quickly stalled out, filed away for nearly 30 years, until a cold case team was created. 10 years ago, that team brought cadaver dogs to an area based off a tip from an informant. According to Annita's daughter, Madonna Lane, that tip led investigators to a site where her dad used to work. He would have been installing power poles, with access to equipment capable of digging 10 feet into the ground. Madonna now lives in Richmond and continues to search for answers in her mother's disappearance. Even though I know in my heart she was murdered, that she didn't abandon me as a little kid, you could still hold out that hope. I was always looking for her in a crowd, always hoping I'd do good enough for her to come forward, she shared. She said her dad remains the main suspect in her mom's disappearance. When the cold case team brought the cadaver dogs to the site, the dogs alerted to human remains being found. Lane said after a short dig, an expert called off the excavation, deeming it improbable any remains were there. Last fall, the family used private resources to search again. Cadaver dogs alerted of human remains. Lane said they came almost exactly in the same spot as 10 years before. The family then brought in ground-penetrating radar and believes there's a disturbance in the ground, which could be their mother's grave. You don't grieve the way you grieve when someone dies. You never get that final saying goodbye moment. It's always a limbo, expressed Lane. The land in question has since been bought and developed. Now, Annita's family needs to find the funds and resources to bring in an environmentalist to plan the excavation, while also paying for the equipment to do so. They will also have to pay for a temporary irrigation system, leading to a retention pond, and any repairs necessary following the dig.
Number 6.
In August of 1934, 21-year-old Olga Mauger seemed to have things going pretty well for her. She had just married wealthy Wyoming oil magnate Carl Mauger after a 2-week whirlwind romance, and the two were madly in love. They also had an upcoming elk hunting trip in the scenic wilderness near Dubois, Wyoming, that they saw as a romantic honeymoon. It seemed as if she had her whole future ahead of her, but she was about to become the center of one of Wyoming's oldest and strangest unsolved Mysteries.The couple made their way to a place called Floyd Stalnaker Camp at Togwitee Pass up in the remote mountains just 6 days after their wedding. And at first the trip was everything they had hoped it would be. On September 17, 1934, the 6th day of their trip, the couple headed out into the wilderness on a scout expedition for elk. At some point during their hike, Carl told his wife he wanted to go up a small ridge not too far away. But Olga said that she was tired and wanted to take a rest. It was a bit strange because Olga was an avid hunter, athletic and in incredible shape to the point that it was usually Carl trying to keep up with her. But at the time he didn't think much of it, and continued up the ridge as she sat down on a rock to rest. Little did he know that this would be the last time he would ever see her again. When Carl returned to the same spot 20 minutes later, his wife was nowhere to be seen. A quick search around the area turned up nothing else, and his calls out to her remained unanswered. Not long after this, authorities were summoned, and they would launch a massive search involving an aircraft and over 300 people, bloodhounds, and even 20 Native American trackers. But they could find no trace of her. The dogs brought in could not find a scent trail. There was nothing. The only thing they managed to turn up was an empty paper sack, in which there had been 3 sandwiches, but no sign of the food. How is it that she could so completely vanish within 20 minutes to the point that not even dogs and expert native trackers could pick up her trail? No one had a clue. But as night approached and the weather got very cold, it was feared that wherever she had gone, Olga, who had been lightly dressed, might not survive. Nevertheless, the search continued on into the coming weeks, and there were some clues that would show up during this time. One was that some local campers would claim to have heard a woman screaming out in the woods of a nearby canyon 3 days after she had gone missing. But this could not be confirmed to have been her. There was also much excitement when a set of footprints were found at a wooded area known as Turpin Meadows, about 8 miles from where Olga had gone missing. The tracks were first thought to be hers, but it would turn out that they were not. There were also some reports of seeing a woman walking along the nearby Togwitee Pass road, but these could not be verified to have been her. The search went on into October until a massive snowstorm hit, and it was called off for good. Rather oddly, shortly after the end of the search, a woman was found in Bridgeport, Nebraska, who allegedly looked so much like Olga that she had to be ruled out. At the time, it was seen as a very odd disappearance for several reasons. One was that Olga had been hunting and fishing in that same area since she was a child, and was very familiar with the terrain, meaning that it seems unlikely she could have gotten lost, and even if she had, why hadn't she called out for help or answered calls out to her? Carl had allegedly been gone for only 20 minutes, so wouldn't she be able to hear him? Also, how could she have managed to so completely elude the dogs and trackers? Why would she have wandered off from her spot on that rock in the first place? No one knew. But there were ideas. One idea was that she had gone down to the road and either hitchhiked a ride or been kidnapped, but why would she have gone there? Another was that she had simply gotten lost and met with misfortune. But with her knowledge of the area, this seemed unlikely, and again, why would she have gone off into the wilderness to begin with? It could also have been a bear attack, but again, this would have made a commotion, and no body or signs of an animal attack had been found. As more information came in, there was also seen the possibility that she had run away to start a new life. It would turn out that her marriage was not as blissful as had been thought. When Olga's sister claimed that the couple had been on the rocks, arguing frequently, and that Olga had been unhappy with the marriage, and had regretted having the wedding so soon. In this scenario, Olga had used the elk hunting trip as a ruse for her escape, knowing that with her outdoor survival skills, no one would be able to follow her. After this, all she had to do was go to the nearby road and hitch a ride to a new life. This might help explain how she was able to evade the search party, and it would also explain the oddity of her wanting her husband to continue on while she took a rest. If she had run away, then it was actually a pretty good plan. Another, more ominous possibility was that it had been foul play. It would be found that Carl had been dating a woman by the name of Ella Chack for 5 or 6 years, when he had met Olga at a dance. It had apparently been serious enough that they had been considering marriage, and Ella was reported as having been very upset about Carl running off with Olga, to the point that it was claimed she had threatened to commit suicide. Yet another witness close to her claimed that Ella and Carl had continued seeing each other after Carl's marriage to Olga, something that Carl vehemently denied. The idea here is that Carl had perhaps murdered Olga to get out of his marriage and get back with Ella. And there were some sinister clues that supported this. One was that he would later contradict his statement that he had been gone 20 minutes, giving a different figure. Even more damning is that the native guides made the observation that Carl Mauger's path away from his wife to the spot he claimed to have gone would have kept him in full view of her sitting place from the moment he left her to the moment he claimed he had returned. An excerpt from the Casper Star-Tribune says of this. They also pointed out that, although the country is rugged, it is open, and that Mauger was in full view of the place where he claimed he left his wife until he reached a small path where he said he turned around and retraced his steps. If this is true, then she would have never been out of his line of sight at all. It seems pretty ominous, but without any real evidence of wrongdoing. There was nothing to go on, and Carl Mauger was never pursued as a suspect. In a curious aside, he would be arrested not long after and put in jail after being mistaken for a wanted criminal who just happened to be his doppelganger and had the name Carl Mauger. Weird, also rather odd, or to be expected, depending on your stance. Carl would later remarry, this time with Ella, the one he had been dating when he married Olga. Coincidence or not, we are left to ask ourselves what happened to Olga. Was this a tragic accident or foul play? Where did she go that day and what became of her? Considering it is one of Wisconsin's oldest cold cases, and there have been no new clues in decades, we will probably never know for sure.
Number 7.
There were rumors about what happened to 21-year-old Army veteran Alvin Matlock after he vanished in 1951, and none of them were good. His brother Clyde was 12 when Alvin disappeared, now 77. Clyde Matlock just wants to find his brother's body. I want to find out what happened to him, he said. Matlock and his wife, Patricia, came to the inaugural missing person event hosted by the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office. People could file police reports, submit DNA and dental records, and provide photographs of loved ones. The Matlock family first knew something was wrong on Thanksgiving Day 1951. When Alvin Matlock didn't show up for the family celebration, his upset mother drove to his cabin on Brown Mountain to find the cabin empty and his vehicles gone. The family was told that he had packed up and gone to Alaska. Clyde Matlock believed that for a while, mostly because he wanted to. But as the years passed, it became clear that Alvin wasn't in Alaska. The story going around was that Alvin Matlock was having an affair with a married woman and had gotten into a fight with her husband when the two were discovered. It's rumored that the woman shot Alvin during the scuffle. The story was he was crying for help, and they just let him die, Patricia Matlock said. Police investigated, but never made an arrest. They didn't have a body, she said. They couldn't arrest anyone. Patricia Matlock has done some detective work of her own in the past few years, trying to find new leads and track down possible witnesses. Somebody must know something, she said. But on Saturday, all Clyde Matlock could do was hand over some photographs of his brother and provide his DNA, in the hopes that someday his brother's remains will be found and identified. Families like the Matlocks now have access to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, database that is also used by police and medical examiners. People can enter information about missing friends or relatives, while medical examiners can post identifying information for unidentified people who have been found dead. Before the NamUs database existed, there was only a hodgepodge of separate, disconnected databases for missing and unidentified people. Forensic pathologist Dr. Sally Aiken said. The databases didn't speak to one another, she said. They were cumbersome. NamUs is a wonderful resource. Her office has used the database to identify 3 people who couldn't be easily identified, Aiken said. When we do identify someone, families are grateful, she said. People want to know what happened to their loved one, even if it ends in death.